Good evening. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Sophie. On behalf of Books and Books, Book Passage, Politics and Prose, Gramercy Books, and Writers for Democratic Action Democracy Book Club, it's my pleasure to welcome you to a virtual evening with Fred Guttenberg and Tom Gabor for American Carnage. Introducing Fred and Tom, we're joined with Spencer Ostrander. Spencer is a Brooklyn-based photographer and has 3 books. His most recent work, Bloodbath Nation, with writer Paul Auster, deals with the historical and contemporary culture of gun laws. Welcome, Spencer.
Thank you. Thank you for your kind words, Sophie. I was drafted not long ago to introduce Dr. Thomas Gabor and Fred Guttenberg, who will discuss their very important new book, American Carnage, Shattering the Myths That Fuel Gun Violence. Their subject is very close to my heart. I spent 2 years driving around the country, photographing the sites of mass shootings for Bloodbath Nation, which I co-authored with Paul Auster. The book began as my photo essay of the ordinary, often banal places where these horrific murders happened: rural, suburban, and urban. No human being and no guns appear in the photographs. The book, however, evolved into something more: an analysis of the history of guns in this country and a culture that is steeped in gun mythology so entrenched it has made its sane conversation nearly impossible. American Carnage, like Bloodbath Nation, are books created to confront the mythology, history, and contemporary social and political realities that have enabled the bloodbaths, the carnage. While American media titillate audiences with stories of the perpetrators and the Republican politicians offer their feeble pieties, thoughts and prayers for the victims, more and more people die. A mass shooter murdered Fred Guttenberg's daughter, Jaime, at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in 2018. Since then, he has devoted himself to changing the gruesome reality that has made gun murder possible. Dr. Thomas Gabor was a professor of criminology for 30 years at University of Ottawa and is now the head of Thomas Gabor LLC, a criminal justice consulting firm in Florida. Their collaboration is part of a growing movement to not just oppose this violence, but to place the debates on guns in this country in context. For me, it is vital to insist that the slaughter we witness every day cannot be separated from the legacy of slavery, the genocide of Native American peoples, class warfare, and the masculine fantasies that have turned brutality into a perverse form of heroism. I will end with a quote from Paul Auster's essay in Bloodbath Nation. Quote, "Peace will only break out when both sides want it. And in order for that to happen, we will need to first conduct an honest, gut-wrenching examination of who we are and who we want to be as a people going forward into the future, which necessarily would have to begin with an honest, gut-wrenching examination of who we have been in the past. Are we ready for this long-deferred national moment of truth and reconciliation? Perhaps not today. But if not today, when?" I thank and welcome Dr. Thomas Gabor and Fred Guttenberg.
Tom, can you see Fred?
No, I cannot.
Let me try it again. Okay, I think we lost Fred. Hold on. Sorry, everyone, minor technical difficulties. We'll be right back. Do you happen to have his number, Tom? Maybe you can reach him.
Okay, I'm going to see if I can reach him. 1 second.
Yep. Fred, can you hear us?
Calling him now.
He just sent on the chat that he is on. If you could exit out and come back on, I'm sure that'll work. Okay, I think he's doing that right now.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone, for your patience.
Okay, he can see us, but we can't see him apparently.
Yes, but he's reconnecting, so
Okay, great.
he should be on
Thank
in.
you.
Let me see. Okay.
Oh, there he is.
Perfect.
You can see and hear me now? Can you
Yes.
see and hear me?
I can see and hear you. I don't know if everybody else
Yes.
can.
You are back
Okay.
on. Perfect.
Perfect. And so I'm not sure what happened, but technology. Thank you, Sophie, and thank you, Spencer. Let me take a few minutes to get us and get myself introduced, and then Tom will do the same. And for all of you who are on here, I truly, truly, truly thank you for being here. For those of you who don't know my story, I'm going to walk you through it. February 14th, 2018, I sent my two children to school, Jesse and Jaime. It was Valentine's Day, and it was a perfectly normal day. My kids were running late. I was pushing them out the door and telling them they got to go. You got to go. You're going to be late. My last words were not, I love you. It was, you got to go. You're going to be late. I expected my children to come home that day. Just after 2 p.m. that day, my daughter, Jaime, and my son, Jesse, were in the Parkland school shooting. My son called me to say, hey, Dad, there's a shooter at my school. And at first I didn't take him seriously until he said, and I can't find Jaime. And when he said that, I said, where are you? And he said, they're telling us to run, but I can't find Jaime. And I stayed on the phone with my son, convincing him to run when he wanted to run back into the building to find his sister. And as he's crying to me that he wants to go and find his sister, we hear boom, 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 3 more shots. Those were the shots on the 3rd floor where my daughter was killed. My son heard it loudly and clearly, and I heard it through the phone. It is because of that sound in my head that my life has been dedicated to the mission of reducing gun violence. I've now been doing this for 5 years. And as part of this work, I have crossed this country, visiting politicians in state capitals, as well as Washington, D.C., in the House, the Senate, and yes, the President. I have worked with many to pass life-saving legislation, and I have fought with many who don't want to. I have worked to elect candidates who want to pass life-saving legislation, and I have worked to fire those who don't want to. Along the way, one thing that became clear to me is that the issue of gun violence got stuck in a series of myths and lies. The whole notion of how we got where we are today was based on a foundation of lies. And I'll just give you a couple of numbers that you need to know. My daughter would be 20 years old this July. 20 years old. She was 14 when she was killed. 20 years ago in 2003, there were only 200 million weapons in America. Today, 20 years later, we have over 400 million plus ghost guns. 20 years ago in 2003, AR-15 sales were less than 2% of all guns sold. Today, 20 years later, they're 25%. I just told you everything you need to know to understand gun violence in America, and everything else you hear is a lie. As an example, who we are as a country, it's the first myth Tom and I take on in our new book. The slogan, the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. That slogan, while it feels like we've lived with it forever, it started after the Sandy Hook shooting. It was actually the NRA response to the Sandy Hook shooting. They turned it into a gun sales bonanza. And so everything this book does, taking on the lies and the myths, helps you to understand how we got to where we are today, how this huge change happened in only 20 years. And I'm so thankful to my good friend Tom, who reached out to me about 2 years ago and said he was working on a project. And the project was wanting to take on the lies and the myths of the gun lobby. And he asked me if I would be willing to do this book with him. And I immediately said yes, because it was the most logical, sensible thing to do, to take on those who have created the gun violence in America today. And this book that just came out May 2nd takes on every lie, every myth, but it also helps you understand how to talk about it, so that going forward, you are armed with the information you will need to be a part of reducing gun violence. I'm going to end with this and then pass it over to Tom. The book came out May 2nd. And I want you all to know, not because I want to brag, but I want you all to know the book has done really, really well. In fact, it made it to number 34 in the country. And the reason I tell you that is it's not a romance or a suspense or a novel or a mystery, the kind of book that people would typically buy. This is a book about gun violence. And books like this are usually written to deliver a message. But the fact that it is done as well as it did, it tells me America is fed up. America wants to know. America wants the truth. And with this book, I hope you all will read it and become a part of helping us get the truth out and ensuring everybody votes in the 24 election for those who understand the truth and for those who want to do something to reduce gun violence. And so I thank you for having us on this today. Tom, I'm going to pass it on to you.
Thank you, Fred. First of all, I'd like to thank Spencer for his gracious introduction, and to Books and Books for putting on this event, and of course, all the bookstores and patrons of bookstores that are with us this evening. And first and foremost, though, I'm absolutely honored to work with my friend Fred, who has taken the most devastating loss, the most unimaginable loss that anybody can experience, and channeling it through over the last 5 years, or over 5 years now, into trying to make our country a better, safer place so that young people can go to school without the fear of being shot. People can go to the shopping mall and theater without constantly being concerned about being shot. Even today, I spoke to a neighbor who said they don't even go to the shopping mall anymore. They order goods online because they're afraid of a mass shooting. This is simply unacceptable. And one statistic I wanted to provide before moving on is a recent poll by Kaiser Health found that 52% of Americans now have had a personal experience with gun violence, either in the form of having been intimidated with a gun, and we know that's often the case, or many times the case in domestic violence. They've been shot, had a family member shot, or witnessed a shooting. So over half of Americans now have experienced firsthand in some way gun violence. So one of the myths we take on in this book is that gun violence only happens over there. Often they're referring to the inner city. And there's, of course, it's somewhat a racist trope as well, because they're talking about inner city people of color. So we don't have to worry here. And that's created a lot of complacency because, in fact, and there's new data out that, in fact, rural areas now, 13 of the 20 leading counties in America, if you can call them leading in terms of gun homicide, are rural counties, not urban counties. So it is a problem throughout the country. It is a concern throughout the country, and everybody should get engaged. But I'd just like to address the slogans because you've all heard a number of them. Guns don't kill, people kill. An armed society is a polite society. And the one that Fred mentioned, the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. And, you know, right there, you get a glimpse of what we call the over 40-year campaign by the gun lobby and its allies to convince Americans that they will be more safe carrying a gun and having a gun in the home. And nothing can be further from the truth. And this is what we address in the book. We address all these myths. But I'll give you an illustration of, this isn't an academic exercise, dealing with and tackling these falsehoods, tackling these distortions and distractions and deflection that we see. That, for example, what we call the mental illness dodge, that's pure deflection. But, you know, there are consequences to these myths and this misinformation or disinformation campaign on the ground. So, for example, we now see 5 times as many Americans over the last 20 years since Jaime was born, Fred's daughter was born. 5 times as many Americans are now carrying a gun daily or almost daily than was the case 20 years ago. 40% of Americans who have a gun in their home now have the gun loaded and accessible, ready to go. So just these 2 things I mentioned. And there's another one I'm sure Fred will discuss with the AR-15, that we're seeing more assault weapons out there as well, far more over the last 20 years. The consequence is that when you have so many people carrying guns, you're going to have situations, it's normal that human beings have altercations, have disputes, but these now are more likely to escalate to a lethal outcome because somebody pulls out a gun. And we are seeing, in fact, road rage incidents with firearms doubling over the last few years. We're seeing more mass shootings at parties, again, because people are bringing guns to parties. As far as guns in the home, because people are more likely today than 20, 30 years ago to own guns for the purpose of self-protection rather than hunting and sport shooting and so forth, they're less likely to secure the guns. So as I mentioned before, more guns are loaded and accessible in the home. So that, unfortunately, is translating to more incidents in the home, cases where young people get a hold of a gun and commit a shooting or school shooting, cases of teenage and other suicide because the gun is more accessible, unintentional or accidental shootings by young people. So all of these are consequences of having guns at the ready, and they're a result of this narrative that the gun lobby has presented to us over 40 years, that we're safer with a nation awash in guns, and where guns are not only plentiful, but they're readily accessible and ready to be used at any time.
You know, Tom, I just want to piggyback onto what you were just saying, because I think it's important when we talk about how many more people are carrying guns and leaving them loaded. It's important to understand some of the myths that created that environment. For example, myths around defensive uses, which has been something the lobby has sold. They've literally treated America as a place where you have good guys and bad guys. And the bad guys are out there. They already have the guns, and the bad guys want to use the guns on you. So you, the good guys, have to go out and have guns to defend yourself from the bad guys. And they used really, really, really flawed data to create a number of defensive uses happening in the country. And it turns out the data was completely debunked. It was false. It was fake. But it didn't matter because they used the data to create the myth. And all that mattered was the myth and the lie, which they were able to have take hold. And that's what we explain in the book. And so they've now created this environment where people believe they're at risk when they're not. But the unfortunate consequence of that and these loaded guns in homes is it's most likely going to get used on you by somebody in your home. And or an unlocked gun may be accessible to a child who doesn't understand safety, and things happen like my friends Mike and Kristen saw, who their son went to play at a friend's house where a loaded gun was left out, and their son was killed that day. So, there's consequences to this. And so I want to just say one thing, and then Tom, I'm going to ask you to do the same. I want us to kind of both maybe talk about something that really shocked us when we saw just how significant a lie it was. And for me, it's who we are as a country, the very first myth we take on. Because I just always assumed America was like this. I just did. But it wasn't. In fact, all the way up until 1977, America was a country with gun owners, but with respect for gun safety. And all the way up until 1977, we were a country that regularly passed measures to ensure safety from gun violence. Up until 1977. In 1977, at the NRA convention in Cincinnati, there was a mutiny, and a guy by the name of Harlan Carter took over the NRA. And what people didn't know at the time about Harlan Carter is he was a convicted murderer, but he changed a vowel in his name, and as a result, nobody knew it. And this convicted murderer, Harlan Carter, pushed the NRA into the direction that we see them now. And that direction was one that understood at the time gun sales were actually declining because there was no longer a draft, and hunting was a declining pastime in America, and started to embrace the gun industry and work with them on new opportunities to sell guns across America. Hence the need to create this notion of defensive uses, which they spent years and years doing, and putting money into candidates who they could sell that strategy to, and successfully. And while the big change didn't happen in the 80s, you really started to see in the 80s with some shall carry laws, and in the 90s, laws starting to soften or change in favor of the gun industry. And the big shift didn't happen until less than 20 years ago. I would call the Stand Your Ground law passed in 2005 in Florida as a really big shift. And the Heller Supreme Court decision in 2008 as a really big shift. But we're talking about 20 years. We have not always been this way. This is not who we are as a country. It is a consequence to the fact that in the past 20 or so years, too many Americans started to think government doesn't work for them and stop voting. If we want to fix this, we can, but we need to vote. In 24, we can reclaim the majority voice on this issue back in the House and the Senate and in the presidency, but we need to vote.
Thank you, Fred. And what you said about the fact that we are actually breaking from our past. The gun lobby wants us to believe that by deregulating, for example, carrying, which has now happened in 26 and counting states, where you no longer need a permit to carry, don't need training, don't need a background check, don't need to understand when it's appropriate to use lethal force. This is an extreme departure from history, as Fred has said. And going back to the Revolutionary period, there was strict regulation. And in fact, annual inventories were taken in places like New Hampshire so that the state knew who owned what firearms, so the firearm could be used for the militia in case there was an attack on the state. But just if we look at the gun lobby for a minute longer, originally the National Rifle Association was formed because there were two officers in the Union following the Civil War among Union troops who were very disappointed in the marksmanship used in the Civil War. So it was initially designed, the National Rifle Association, to improve marksmanship. And over the years, they were very concerned about gun safety for young people, had many programs and so forth. But also back in the 1880s, gun carrying was banned. Concealed weapons carrying was banned in most of the states. And back in the 1930s, the head of the NRA said, I'm opposed to the promiscuous toting of guns. And now they've done a complete 180, where for the reasons that Fred mentioned, there's been a campaign to pass in every state, and we have in every state now, the ability to carry concealed firearms. In virtually every state, the ability to carry firearms openly. And now what's the latest trend? Let's get rid of, there's certainly, as I've described before, more people carrying guns, partly as a result of this campaign. So now their next frontier, and they're well on their way, is to remove the need for permits. So the analogy I draw is that you increase fivefold, as we have carrying, by 5 times the number of cars on the road. And at the same time, you tell people, you no longer need a driver's permit. We're going to give you the key. You don't need to take driver's education. You don't need to know the rules of the road. And what can we expect as a result? It's a catastrophe. And that's what we're seeing now in America. It's coming home to roost, unfortunately. Mass shootings have doubled in the last 10 years. We're seeing the most recent data shows 50,000 Americans, or close to 50,000, are dying. We see all the people personally affected by gun violence. A third of Americans are afraid to go to certain places because of the fear of mass shootings. So we're in a much worse place than we've ever been. And that correlates with the campaign to pass all these extreme laws and increase gun rights in this country rather than restrict guns in various ways that is done in most other countries.
Tom, you've heard me say it a bunch this past month, and I'm going to say it again. Stop listening to the liars. It is the truth is that this is not complicated to understand. Understanding how we've gone from 2% of sales with AR-15s only 20 years ago to 25% now is not hard to understand when you look at what actually happened, where literally, while the majority of America does get it, polls are clear, about 80% don't like what's happening, a minority of America and politicians are forcing a change in gun laws, and they're doing it through lies. And unfortunately, they've said we should have no new laws on guns because that's a slippery slope, while they've been passing laws on guns. And there's been a slippery slope, but it's led to more gun violence. Laws like stand your ground and carry and permitless and all that stuff. Stop listening to the liars. The thing about this book, it will arm you with facts. It will arm you with truth. It will arm you with the information you need to be an informed voter, because at the end of the day, that will be how we fix this. But it is time for us to stop listening to the liars, stop listening to the politicians who spout all the gun lobby BS. And when you know they're lying, immediately say, we're not having that conversation here. This is the facts. This is what I know. It is time to stop listening to the liars. Tom, I don't know if you have a final comment, and then we'll take questions.
Yeah, I was just about to say the same. I'd just like to add that, in the book, we also outline what the average citizen can do. Steps that they can take, because people feel powerless. They feel the gun lobby is all powerful, and it is not. There are also changes that we're seeing on the ground. A new Fox News poll told us that over 80% of Americans favor universal background checks, red flag laws, raising the age for gun purchases, and so forth. So the amount of outrage in the country is increasing. It's not a 50-50 split between people who are for and against changes in the gun laws. We are the majority by probably 80 to 20% with regard to most measures. But it's been a very powerful lobby, a very powerful minority and vocal minority. So just to echo what Fred has said, first of all, I'm optimistic because I see more happening on the ground. For example, Students Demand Action, a group that's an offshoot from Moms Demand Action. They've doubled the number of chapters, I think, in recent months. So there are more young people engaged. What I would urge you to do, as Fred has done on many occasions, not only should people vote, but vote for people who are committed to this area, people who make specific commitments about policies, whether those policies are improving the background check system, whether it's policies relating to assault style weapons, red flag laws. Hold your leaders accountable. And the only way to do that is make sure you're not supporting people who make these vague statements about, I'm going to fight for preventing gun violence. Let's put their feet to the fire in terms of what they stand for. Will they support an assault weapons ban? Will they support a better background check system? Because then they can be held accountable if they don't follow and actually carry out those promises. So I would leave you with that, and please take a look at the book in terms of the steps that individual citizens can take to empower yourself and to make a difference in this area. Thank you.
All right, everyone, we are ready to take questions. If you haven't gotten your questions on, please do so now. We'll be going through them. And Tom, Fred, thank you both so much. This issue is extremely important to me. It's extremely important to America, and I wanted to salute you guys on the work that you've done and the work that you continue to do. I'm very thankful. So thank you.
Thank you, Sophie.
Thank you.
So we're just going to go through the questions.
While you're doing that, there's a comment here, and I want to say something because I think it really gets to an important part of what Tom and I are trying to do. It says there are many anti-gun groups. Why don't they combine? They're not anti-gun groups, and Tom and I are not anti-gun people. We are anti-gun violence. And I think the gun lobby loves it when people talk in terms of pro-gun and anti-gun. It actually helps to foster the myths and the lies, but we're not. We are anti-gun violence. We want to stop gun violence. We want to do it with truth. And as for the question about why don't they get together, boy, I wish there could be more collaboration. And for the same reason, in a lot of industries where you have multiple entities, the same thing exists here, but they do occasionally work together.
Right.
And I want to apologize to the person because it wasn't to engage in semantics. I think it's really important, the language that we use on this, because we do want to get change.
What is one practical action the average citizen can take to disarm their community?
Okay, again, I would jump in and say our goal is not to disarm Americans. Disarmament has never happened. We are against gun violence, not against guns, not against the Constitution, which has, by the way, in my view, been completely mangled. But that's another discussion for another day. But there are certainly, I think, helping disabuse people of the idea that you are safer with a gun in your home. Now, I'm not in the business personally of giving people individual advice as to whether they should or shouldn't have a gun in their home. And there are instances that I would concede where somebody, say, has been facing imminent threat of death, say, from an ex-partner. That's a different ballgame. And if they have no other way to protect themselves. But, as far as a general policy for the average citizen, it is very clear that there are far more perils, far more dangers to having a gun in your home, for example, than there are benefits. I'll give you one statistic because Fred's already talked about this. Yeah, one of the best known researchers in this area conducted a study and found that for every time a homeowner uses a gun against an intruder, shoots an intruder, there are 22 times as many incidents with that gun where the gun is turned on a member of that family, either in domestic violence, a suicide attempt, an accident. So there are far more risks than benefits to a gun in the home. And there's been bogus research to the contrary, but it's very clear it's not even close. So for the average citizen, I think they need to be informed of those facts. And that's the reason we wrote this book.
Yeah, and I'll just say this. Disarmament is not a goal. We have a constitution, and I think it is fair to question and litigate what the Second Amendment actually says, because there's been a lot of misinterpretation. But I think the way I would answer that is, if disarmament isn't a goal, then what are the goals, right? And for me, there's 3 goals. I want to do whatever we can together to lower the gun violence death rate. I want to do whatever we can together to reduce the instances of gun violence. I want to do whatever we can together to reduce the severity of gun violence injuries when gun violence happens. And, and to do so, we have to start with the truth. We have to start with understanding that the majority of gun owners feel like Tom and I. They want to reduce gun violence too, and they agree on so many of the necessary steps. There is a well-financed lobby that gets in the middle, but you know what? We need to fire the politicians who keep embracing that lobby.
Yeah. If I can jump in, there's a question by Lisa who says she wants to be supportive, but not finding a way to make a change. And somebody once said, unfortunately, I don't recall who it is, that nothing worth doing is easy. It took a long time for women to get the vote. It took a long time for civil rights legislation to take place. Now, in this case, obviously, we're hoping for change as soon as possible, and change can come with a decisive victory in an election. Because unlike some of the other issues, every day in America, 130 people are dying of gunfire. 130 now, it is. So it is an urgent issue, but we must persevere. There is a way forward. Yes, there are impediments with the courts and the political system, and that's well beyond our discussion today. But a decisive victory is key. And I can just say that in Florida, we had 2.5 million Democrats, registered Democrats, who stayed home in the last election. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, while this isn't a partisan discussion, it's the case over the last 40 years that the Democratic Party has passed, or Democratic presidents have signed laws that promote gun safety, such as the assault weapons ban, the Brady background bill, and so forth. And the Republican Party, unfortunately, has aligned itself more to the gun lobby and to gun owners. And so for the time being, without being overly partisan, I think it's important, because that's, again, another fact, that one party has supported change in this area and the other party has obstructed it.
And I'll just add, because I think there's a lot of reason for hope if we vote, right? So if you would have told me in 2018 that we could accomplish the change we did politically across the country and get the Safer Communities Act passed this July and get an ATF director appointed, which we did, I would have told you probably not. That's too tall a task. But we all went to work and we worked hard. And in 2018, we flipped the House. In 2020, we also elected a Senate that wanted to do something about this and a president. And because people voted and we have more people serving, we were able to get stuff done. Now, unfortunately, gun sales continue to grow, but we're getting there. We have to vote.
And we do have a couple questions through the Q&A, so I'm just going to ask them. Can you recommend specific charitable or political organizations we might donate money or time to?
Listen, I'll start. And I'll go to the one that's most personal, near and dear to my heart, which is my own. It's Orange Ribbons for Jaime, and Jaime is spelled Jaime. We educate on the reasons why my daughter's life was cut short, but we also do things to honor Jamie's life with ways that would have mattered to her if she were alive today. For example, a college scholarship program, and our newest initiative, Paws of Love, where we're giving dogs to families affected by gun violence, plus the entire first year of ownership with the dog. And so if you're looking for a pure advocacy group, I do a lot of work with all the big groups. Brady is near and dear to my heart, and I do a lot of advising with them. But there are other groups out there too. Some of the grassroots groups like Newtown Action, and then the other big groups, like Everytown. I mean, there's a lot of groups that are all fighting to get this work done. And so I think that's a wonderful question, and I thank the person for asking it.
Yeah, and I would agree with Fred. Would certainly support the wonderful work that he and his wife Jennifer are doing, and compassionate work, so that victims of gun violence, for example, they're donating a dog, I guess golden doodles, I believe, to some of the victims or survivors, I should say. So that's a wonderful thing they're doing. Fred's more familiar with the national groups on a personal level than me, but I have a leaning to Brady. They're one of the original anti-gun violence groups. They've been around at least since the 1970s, and they've been certainly extremely supportive.
And they do great policy and legal work.
Exactly, and supportive of our even getting this message out on the myths that exist in this area. So I'm a little partial to them, but there are many worthy organizations.
Thank you. Do you think that we are finally getting close to a tipping point in the resistance to all meaningful gun restrictions? Are there any hopeful signs?
I will answer it this way. I think a big shift happened in this country about 6 weeks ago. And it started when somebody got shot for ringing the wrong doorbell. The same week somebody got shot for going into the wrong driveway. And a teenager, a cheerleader in Texas, got shot for walking up to the wrong car. That galvanized America the way mass shootings used to. And I think America saw that and said, mass shootings always seemed like there was happening somewhere else, but this feels like this could happen to me. Like I've gone up to the wrong door. I've gone up to the wrong car. And I think America finally got to a place where they realized we're at risk if we just make a mistake. Exactly. And that changed something in this country. And candidly, I actually think that's part of why this book has done so well. Because I think America is now at a place where they don't want it to be this way anymore.
And just to totally agree with Fred. I think though that cluster of events, I think there were about 4 cases that happened within a week where people just did the ordinary things that any one of us might do. And I think also impactful in those cases was the fact that in several of them, at least, maybe all of them, the shooter was an individual who just seemed primed, ready to shoot at a moment's notice. I mean, the fellow who shot through his door because a young man who happened to be a person of color knocked on his door. And he evidently had a gun very close by because he was able to deploy it very quickly. And if it wasn't for fate, that young man would be dead today because he had a bullet grazed his brain. And so we also got to see that there seemed to be too many individuals in this country, in this and the other cases, who seem unhinged on one hand, and at the same time have access to these firearms. And, that supports something I, as a criminologist, know, because there was a study done a few years ago that found, we hear this mental illness, what I call the mental illness dodge and deflection. But a bigger problem in this country, and there are mental health problems here, but there are mental health problems in other countries. We just make it a lot easier for somebody who is unstable to get a hold of highly lethal weapons, even weapons of war. But one study found that over 20 million Americans have a serious anger issue and own guns. And so we have to do a whole lot better job of vetting who gets a hold of a lethal instrument like a firearm. So I think that's the other part of that equation. Not only are people thinking that could have been me knocking on the door or turning in the wrong driveway and I could have been shot, but they're also looking at the shooter and saying, these people, you have all these people who are unhinged, which you have in other countries too, with firearms, and these firearms are ready to be deployed quickly. And this is what I was talking about before, that more people are holding guns for the purpose of perceived self-protection. And then this is enabled also by the stand your ground laws, because it's entirely conceivable that somebody like that fellow shot through his door would be viewed as acting legitimately, because what stand your ground laws say is if you have a reasonable belief, it might be a wrong belief, but a reasonable belief, because somebody you don't know, somebody who doesn't live in that neighborhood knocked on your door, so you believe they're a threat. And that's sufficient to use lethal force in about 30 states right now.
Mm-hmm. We have another question asking, does your book address the Supreme Court's misinterpretation of the well-regulated militia clause?
Yes, it does.
Go ahead, Tom.
It does. I've had some very interesting conversations, even today, on social media. And, I'll just say one thing, because this is a very long conversation. A lot of controversy about what the Constitution guarantees and does not guarantee. I'll just tell you one thing, because Fred and I are not constitutional scholars, and as I often say, nor are our critics. However, one person who is a constitutional scholar, his name is Professor Michael Waldman. He's with New York University's Brennan School of Law. And he actually looked at the notes from the 1787 convention, where the framers of the Constitution discussed the Second Amendment and the entire Bill of Rights. And Madison, of course, drafted the Bill of Rights, James Madison. And he found, Professor Waldman, nothing in the notes of the framers, not one reference to guns for self-protection, guns for hunting, guns for sport shooting. The entire discussion was firearms for the purpose of service in a militia, because there was no standing army in the early years. So the framers certainly never envisioned gun ownership by individual Americans to be deployed against their fellow citizens. And especially, they never envisioned weapons like AR-15s and people walking around with those, 20 million or more in America, again, to be deployed against fellow citizens. So this is a fact. The framers never envisioned guns for personal self-defense, according to historians and constitutional scholars.
And just on the Supreme Court, because it is currently being used to maybe add an additional meaning or interpretation to the Second Amendment. And what I mean by that is, I talked about the history of who we are as a country. We've always been a gun safety country. We've always passed gun safety laws. Last year, there was a case, the Bruen case, Second Amendment case, where the Supreme Court struck down a law that was over 100 years old, okay? And it Well, I'll tell you, I spoke to a constitutional expert last week, Judge Luddig, who you may remember from the January 6th hearings. And Judge Luddig actually wrote an amicus brief to the Supreme Court on that case, and he disagreed with the outcome. And he is a constitutional expert. I'll also say this. In 2008, we had the Heller decision. And the thing about the Heller decision is out of that came a phrase, common use. Common use provided essentially additional language that never existed in the Second Amendment. But what it basically went on to say is any weapon that is in common use and the most commonly owned weapon of its class can't be restricted. And that's in a nutshell. I'm not going to say it like a lawyer. Here's why that mattered. In 2008 and 2003, when my daughter was born, AR-15s were less than 2% of all guns sold. The ban ended in 2004. There wasn't much of a change after that. But in 2008, when the Heller decision came out, AR-15s were under 5% of all weapons sold. But that common use, the industry took that and created a business strategy out of it to over-manufacture these weapons and flood our streets with them without any regard for safety, to the point where here we are 15 years later, 15 years, and they are now 25% of all guns sold. And you will see a future Supreme Court case look at the issue of whether or not we can restrict AR-15s. And there is a chance that the Supreme Court will use the common use language, which is only came out 15 years ago, to say they can't. And so it's really important that we understand the facts, the truth, the history, because we need to put a stop to this.
How do you address politicians/representatives who blame gerrymandering?
Who blame gerrymandering? I'm not sure I understand the question.
How do you address politicians/representatives who use gerrymandering, our hands are tied
as an excuse? Okay.
Yes.
So what I would say to that is this. The next time it could be someone you love. And so rather than saying, I can't do anything, because the I can't do anything mentality can be applied to every issue if you're going to blame gerrymandering. So if you're going to blame gerrymandering on this, then what you're telling me is you don't see a path forward to even do your job. So go home and someone else can come in to do it. But ideally, if they think gerrymandering will prevent them from doing it, we provide them with the facts. We show them the path forward. We show them how they can be a part of stopping the next one. And we don't let them get away with the lies that would ultimately lead them to say something like that. The truth is, most of the politicians who would make a statement like that are opposed to doing anything to reduce gun violence. Mm-hmm. And for that reason, I do everything I can to fire them.
Right.
How can we combat the current judicial and legislative free-for-all created by gun rights advocates who are pressing for new laws to make it easier to be armed?
Yeah. Well, I would say that, one difference over the last 20, 30 years between the gun rights community, if you wish, and those who advocate for public safety or gun safety, is that gun rights activists have tended to be single issue voters, and they get more involved in the political process. They tend to vote more regularly. They donate more money to political campaigns. They call and write letters more frequently to their legislators. And so it's really important to counter that with an equally active and vigorous type of mobilization by people who truly believe in making this country a safer place. And I think I agree with Fred that we have a few issues that are top of mind in the country right now, and gun safety is certainly one of them. If people want to make a difference, and really, in my view, there is no freedom where there is no security. If people don't feel safe to go to the shopping mall, to go to a theater. To me, their freedom has severely eroded. And so this should be foremost in people's minds. And even if they're concerned about other issues, certainly whether it's the abortion issue, the climate issue, and so forth, that's fine. But no, get out there and vote, and make sure that when you vote in this, for what your candidate should be strong in the area of gun safety. It should be a strong proponent for specific issues and specific measures that will make a difference and save lives.
And I'll say this, and I've always tried to teach my kids this. It's really easy to talk to people who you agree with, but it's really important and necessary to talk to those who maybe you don't agree with. And so when someone tells me that, hey, I'm a gun rights supporter, that doesn't mean they're against reducing gun violence. In fact, many gun rights supporters are also for steps to reduce gun violence. They understand that this unrestricted access to weapons can be a risk to them as well. And so I always try to find some common ground for us to talk through. Tom will tell you, when we were in DC, every time we went into a Republican's office, especially those who have been very publicly opposed to doing anything, we still tried. We tried. Mm-hmm. Didn't mean we were always successful. We were in Thomas Massey's office from Kentucky, and we ended up talking to his aide. And Thomas Massey was sitting maybe 10 feet from us through an open door watching the entire conversation, which went on for about 20 minutes. It came to an end when the legislative aide essentially said that the truth is my daughter could have just been killed with a rock and that the gun didn't matter. At which point there wasn't any point in going any further. But what was so interesting is Thomas Massey tried to walk by Tom and I with his head down, trying not to be noticed because he had to go to his office. And when I said, Congressman, I'm wondering if you were listening to the conversation, he said, all of it. And I said, I just want you to know who we are. And he goes, oh, I know who you are. And he kept on walking. Okay. There are people like him. You're not going to change them, but we have to fire them.
Right. And just to further to that point, there's a misconception, and we also talk about that in the book, that the country is lined up, gun owners against non-owners, and 50-50 split between those who are for or against reform in this area. And that's absolutely not the case. Even most NRA members, rank and file, support some of the measures that we've mentioned here and that are being talked about today. So you see, why that's a dangerous myth is that a lot of people out there do believe this is hopeless, and we're hopelessly divided. The country is irreconcilably broken, and we can't get anything done in this area or other areas. And this simply isn't the truth. That's why this poll was so important the other day that showed that 80% of Americans support some of the basic measures that we're talking about. And there are groups that are forming now where there's a combination of gun owners and non-owners sitting down and trying to find common ground. So I think that's hopeful.
So we have one last question. Can you suggest 2 or 3 gun control laws you would like to see passed that you think would be practical, doable, and in particular effective?
Yeah, well,
I'll start. I want to repeal PLCAA, which is the federal shield on lawsuits. I want to be able to sue these manufacturers. I want the documents behind the decisions that they make. That's number one. Number two, I think red flag laws should be the law of the land on a national level, no questions asked. And number three, I personally think the holy grail to solving gun violence is through ammunition. We need to extend background checks to ammunition.
Yeah, I would just totally agree with Fred with regard to, everything he said, but in particular, the PLCAA law that shields the industry from liability. Because if you're able to sue the manufacturer and perhaps the dealer, if they were also negligent, for a horror like the horror in Parkland or Sandy Hook or Uvalde, then there's ultimately a bottom line that all businesses are concerned about, and they might draw the conclusion that it's not in their interest to sell these weapons of war. So that's kind of what I call a market-driven approach, because it's a heavier lift to ban assault weapons. I would still try to do that. Then the other one for me, because I've studied licensing systems around the world, and that is establishing a licensing system, national one, for gun owners. And that means that we don't just do a quick and dirty, because unfortunately that's what it is now, 2-minute background check today, where a lot of information of 3 FBI databases. And if somebody passes that, away they go, and the sale can proceed. In a licensing system, which we have in some of the states, but in other countries is more thorough, you have an interview with law enforcement. You have some reference checks. So people like the Parkland shooter, all their misbehavior and all the things that they've done and threats they've made would come to the attention of the authorities. Also, something to consider as we see more and more cases of domestic violence, including guns. In Canada, when a person applies for a gun license, their spouse or ex-spouse, whichever is relevant, is notified of that application. Now, they don't have a veto, but they can let authorities know that, my spouse or ex-spouse has exhibited unstable behavior. They were involved in domestic violence, but it was never reported. They had a substance abuse problem, and then the authorities can investigate. So I'm a very big believer in a licensing system for gun owners.
Well, Fred, Tom, thank you for this incredibly insightful conversation. On behalf of Books and Books, on behalf of the other indie stores, and on behalf of WDA, we're incredibly grateful to you and for joining us and for spreading the word. And everyone, please purchase your copy of American Carnage from your local independent bookstore. I really appreciate you guys.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you very much.
Broadcast now.
Bye now.
Take care.